Nikita Koloff had zero Russian heritage, couldn't speak a word of Russian, and had never even been to Russia. Yet he became the most convincing Soviet villain in wrestling history during the height of the Cold War. For 2 years straight, he maintained this character 24/7, learning Russian phrases, legally changing his name, and fooling everyone, including his own colleagues. The transformation was so complete that fans genuinely believed America's enemy was right there in the ring. But the real story behind Nikita Koloff's creation reveals wrestling's greatest deception. Simpson's path to that deception began years earlier on the football fields of Minnesota. After graduating from Robbinsdale High in 1977, Nelson Scott Simpson had everything going for him at Golden Valley Lutheran College. At 6 feet 2 inches and 275 pounds, he was a standout football player with the kind of size and athleticism that college scouts dream about. He dominated the field alongside his teammate Joe Laurinaitis, and both young men shared the same dream that drives thousands of college athletes every year. They wanted to make it to the NFL, but football is a brutal game that destroys dreams as often as it creates them. Simpson transferred to Minnesota State University Moorhead to continue his football career, but his body had other plans. A series of injuries began to pile up during his time there. Each setback made it harder for Simpson to perform at the level he needed to catch the attention of NFL scouts. While Simpson was dealing with his mounting injury problems, Laurinaitis was taking a completely different path. He had discovered professional wrestling and was making a name for himself as Road Warrior Animal. The wrestling world was perfect for someone with Laurinaitis' size and intensity. He had found his calling in the squared circle, while his old college teammate was still nursing his wounds and wondering what came next. Simpson watched from the sidelines as his NFL dreams slowly faded away. The injuries had taken their toll, and professional football was no longer a realistic option. By 1984, he was considering a tryout with the USFL, but he was a young man in his early 20s with no clear direction in life. The sport that had defined him since childhood was slipping away, and he had to figure out what to do next. The phone call that changed everything came in 1984. Laurinaitis reached out to his old teammate with an opportunity that seemed to come out of nowhere. Jim Crockett Jr., who ran Jim Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas, was looking for a new monster heel. Laurinaitis had been thinking about his old college teammate and thought Simpson might be perfect for what Crockett had in mind. Simpson had never considered professional wrestling as a career option. He knew nothing about the business and had no training in the sport. But Laurinaitis insisted that Simpson had the perfect look for what Crockett needed. At 6 feet 2 inches and 275 pounds, Simpson still had the intimidating physical presence that had made him successful on the football field. Wrestling promoters were always looking for big, athletic men who could play convincing villains. Animal told him to shave his head and show up. Crockett was interested when Laurinaitis told him about Simpson, and the promoter had something specific in mind. Jim Crockett Jr. envisioned a Russian monster heel. Road Warrior Animal called Simpson to try wrestling, and Crockett renamed him Nikita Koloff and paired him with Ivan Koloff as his nephew from the Soviet Union. The proposal was both terrifying and exciting. Simpson had to decide if he was willing to take on this new identity for a chance at success in a business he knew nothing about. The idea of completely transforming himself for a character seemed extreme, but Simpson was at a crossroads in his life with limited options. Simpson agreed to Crockett's proposal, not knowing that this decision would launch one of the most convincing villain performances in wrestling history. He was about to become Nikita Koloff, and the wrestling world would never be the same. The transformation that followed would be so complete that people who knew Simpson personally would struggle to recognize him. He debuted in June 1984 and won his first televised match in just 13 seconds. Simpson was stepping into a role that would define the rest of his life, but first he would have to master the art of becoming someone else entirely. The creation of Nikita Koloff would test the limits of what was possible in professional wrestling. Jim Crockett Jr. had a radical idea that would push professional wrestling kayfabe beyond anything the industry had ever seen before. The year was 1984, and Cold War tensions between America and the Soviet Union were at their peak. President Reagan was calling the USSR an evil empire, and American audiences were hungry for villains they could truly hate. Crockett saw an opportunity to create the ultimate Soviet villain, and he had the perfect plan. He would bill Simpson as Ivan Koloff's nephew from the Soviet Union and give him the nickname the Russian Nightmare as a direct foil to Dusty Rhodes. Eddie Sharkey provided brief ring training, but the real work would be in character development. The wrestling business had always featured foreign heels who played up their nationalities for heat. German characters like Baron von Raschke got booed for their Nazi connections. Japanese wrestlers like Professor Toru Tanaka drew hatred through Pearl Harbor references. But Crockett wanted something different. He wanted a Russian character so authentic that fans would believe they were watching a real Soviet athlete who had come to America to destroy everything they held dear. The problem was obvious from the start. Simpson had zero Russian heritage and couldn't speak a word of the language. He was as American as apple pie, born and raised in Minneapolis, with no connection to the Soviet Union whatsoever. Most promoters would have seen this as an impossible barrier, but Crockett saw it as the ultimate test of professional wrestling's power to create believable fiction. Crockett insisted on total commitment from Simpson. This wouldn't be a part-time character that Simpson could turn on and off at will. He would become Ivan Koloff's nephew from the Soviet Union, and that identity would consume every aspect of his existence. Simpson would have to live, breathe, and think like a Russian athlete every single day. There could be no breaks, no slip-ups, and no moments where the real Nelson Simpson showed through. Crockett made his expectations crystal clear with a strict warning that if Koloff ever tripped on the ropes or made any mistake that exposed the character, he would be fired immediately. The transformation began immediately with a complete physical makeover. Simpson's hair was shaved completely off, giving him the intimidating bald look that would become his trademark. His entire wardrobe was replaced with clothing that fit his new Soviet identity. Even his posture and the way he walked had to change to match what American audiences expected from a Russian athlete. Simpson learned Russian phrases, refused to break character outside the ring, and maintained the persona continuously for about 2 years. He studied Soviet culture, politics, and mannerisms until he could convincingly portray someone who had grown up in the USSR. Hours each day were spent listening to Russian language tapes and practicing the thick accent that would become Nikita Koloff's signature. He studied how Soviet athletes carried themselves in interviews and copied their body language down to the smallest details. The pressure was enormous. Simpson had to master not just the physical aspects of professional wrestling, but also maintain a complete psychological transformation every waking moment. He practiced speaking English with a thick Russian accent until it became second nature. He studied Soviet political rhetoric so he could cut believable promos about the superiority of the communist system. Every detail had to be perfect, because one mistake would expose the entire deception. On his 1984 debut, the newly christened Nikita Koloff stepped into the ring and destroyed his opponent in just 13 seconds. The crowd watched in stunned silence as this massive Russian athlete demolished an American wrestler with brutal efficiency. His victory wasn't just impressive from a wrestling standpoint. It was a psychological victory that established his character as a legitimate threat to everything American wrestling fans believed in. The Russian Nightmare had arrived, billed from the Soviet Union and later from Lithuania after the Soviet collapse. Nobody in that arena suspected the truth about his American origins. Simpson had successfully erased his real identity and become someone completely different. Fans genuinely believed they were watching a Soviet athlete who had come to America to prove the superiority of the communist system. The transformation was so complete that even experienced wrestling observers were fooled by the deception. But maintaining this level of deception would require something most wrestlers had never attempted before. Koloff spoke in a thick Russian accent when he ordered food at restaurants. He maintained his Soviet persona when he checked into hotels. He rarely, if ever, broke character around other wrestlers in the locker room or during long road trips between shows. This wasn't just about putting on an accent for television interviews or wrestling matches. The dedication was unlike anything the wrestling business had ever seen before. Koloff committed to maintaining his Russian persona around the clock for 2 solid years straight. Other foreign wrestlers would slip into their normal voices when they thought nobody was listening. They would joke around backstage in their natural accents or speak normally to friends and family. Koloff never gave himself that luxury. Every conversation was filtered through his Russian character, no matter how casual or private the setting might be. Fellow wrestlers, reporters, and even close friends rarely saw him break character during those 2 years. He spoke to everyone using the same broken English and thick accent that fans heard on television. When wrestlers gathered in hotel lobbies after shows, Koloff would sit with them speaking like a Soviet athlete who was still learning American customs. During interviews with wrestling magazines, he never slipped up and revealed his true identity. The performance was so consistent that people began to forget it was a performance at all. Koloff studied Russian language tapes every day, like his career depended on it. He ordered Russian food and had Russian magazines delivered to maintain authenticity. The accent that had started as an imitation gradually became automatic. He no longer had to think about how to pronounce English words with a Russian inflection. His body language changed to match what Americans expected from a Soviet athlete. Even his facial expressions became more serious and stoic to fit the character. The commitment was so complete that even some colleagues and local staff treated him as if he were Russian. Wrestlers who worked with him every night started asking him questions about life in the USSR, and he would answer them with the conviction of someone who had actually lived there. Veteran wrestlers who had seen every trick in the business were completely fooled by his dedication to the character. Restaurant servers and hotel staff across the country bought into the deception without question. When Koloff checked into hotels, front desk clerks would hear his accent and assume he was exactly who he claimed to be. Waitresses would speak slowly to help him understand the menu, not realizing they were talking to someone who had grown up in Minneapolis. Airport security would sometimes give him extra attention because of his Russian identity, and he would handle these situations without ever breaking character. Backstage, wrestlers would sometimes try to catch him off guard to see if they could make him slip up. They would ask unexpected questions or make jokes to see if he would respond naturally. Koloff never gave them the satisfaction of seeing the real person underneath. His commitment was so absolute that it became legendary among his peers. Even wrestlers who didn't like the character had to respect the dedication it took to maintain such an elaborate deception. The constant performance took a real psychological toll, limiting private life and close friendships. Koloff couldn't form genuine relationships because nobody knew who he really was. Every relationship was built on a lie, even if the lie was for entertainment purposes. He would later legally adopt the name Nikita Koloff during the mid-1980s. This wasn't just a stage name anymore, it was his legal identity recognized by the government. The transformation from Nelson Simpson to Nikita Koloff was now complete in every possible way. His driver's license, social security card, and every other official document reflected his new identity. His dedication to the character had become so complete that the line between Nelson and Nikita had disappeared entirely. The young football player from Minneapolis was gone, replaced by a Soviet athlete who felt more real than the original person ever had. The deception was working perfectly, but now it was time to put this character to the ultimate test in the ring. Koloff's championship assault began immediately and showed no signs of slowing down. Within months of his debut, he had transformed from an unknown rookie into one of the most dominant forces in professional wrestling. His partnership with Ivan Koloff created a Soviet alliance that seemed unstoppable, and American fans watched in horror as these two Russian athletes carved a path of destruction through their beloved wrestling heroes. In December 1984, Koloff captured the NWA World Six-Man Tag Team Championship alongside Ivan Koloff and Crusher Khrushchev. This victory gave the Soviet faction their first major championship gold and proved they could compete at the highest levels of professional wrestling. The championship reign established them as legitimate threats to American wrestlers across all divisions. Wrestling fans had never seen a foreign stable dominate so completely in such a short period of time. The March 18, 1985, victory over beloved Americans Dusty Rhodes and Manny Fernandez for the NWA World Tag Team Championship sent shockwaves through the wrestling world. Rhodes was the common man's hero, a wrestler who represented everything good about American values and fighting spirit. Fernandez was equally beloved as a tough, no-nonsense competitor who never backed down from a fight. When the Koloffs defeated these two American icons, It felt like a genuine attack on American wrestling itself. Fans left arenas that night wondering if their heroes could ever overcome this Soviet invasion. Their heel work and violent stipulation matches, especially against the Road Warriors, made them one of the most loathed acts in the mid-Atlantic territory. The Koloffs used every dirty trick in the book to win matches. They would double-team opponents when referees weren't looking. They brought foreign objects into the ring to gain unfair advantages. They showed no respect for American traditions or the unwritten rules that governed professional wrestling. Koloff's signature Russian sickle finisher became the most feared move in professional wrestling during this period. The clothesline looked devastating when Koloff delivered it with his full 275-pound frame behind the impact. Opponents would crumple to the mat like they had been hit by a truck. The move was simple but brutally effective, much like everything else about Koloff's wrestling style. He didn't need fancy technical moves or high-flying maneuvers. Raw power and intensity were all he needed to destroy his opponents. Russian chain matches became Koloff's specialty, adding extra brutality to his victories. These matches combined the punishment of a steel cage with the weapon potential of a heavy chain. Koloff would use the chain to choke opponents or deliver devastating strikes that left them bloodied and beaten. The sight of this massive Russian athlete using a chain as a weapon created visceral reactions from audiences who genuinely feared for the safety of American wrestlers facing him. The championship gold kept coming as Koloff's dominance continued throughout 1985. He captured the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship, adding another prestigious title to his growing collection. Later, he would also claim the NWA World Television Championship, including the UWF TV title unification. Each victory felt like another nail in the coffin of American wrestling supremacy. Fans watched helplessly as their heroes fell one by one to this Soviet destroyer who seemed impossible to stop. By July 1985, he was challenging Ric Flair for the NWA World Championship at the Great American Bash. This represented the ultimate goal for any professional wrestler. The NWA World Championship was the most prestigious title in the sport, and Koloff had earned his shot at it through pure dominance. The fact that a Russian athlete was challenging for American wrestling's top prize felt like the final stage of a foreign invasion that had been building for months. The Russian nightmare had evolved from monster heel to legitimate main event championship contender in less than 2 years. His rise through the wrestling ranks was unprecedented for someone with so little experience in the business. Most wrestlers took years to develop the skills and credibility needed to challenge for world championships. Koloff had achieved that status through sheer force of character and an unmatched commitment to his Soviet persona. American wrestling had never seen a foreign villain this convincing or this successful, but Koloff's greatest test was still ahead of him, and it would come in the form of the perfect American hero. Terry Allen, known to wrestling fans as Magnum TA, was that perfect counterpart. This wasn't just another wrestling rivalry between a heel and a face. This was a clash of ideologies that perfectly captured the Cold War tensions of the mid-1980s. Magnum TA represented everything good about American wrestling. He had natural charisma that connected with audiences instantly. His wrestling skills were legitimate and impressive. Most importantly, he carried himself with the kind of patriotic values that made him the ideal opponent for Koloff's Soviet character. Magnum TA was everything that American wrestling fans wanted their heroes to be. He was handsome without being pretty. He was tough without being cruel. He spoke with conviction about American values without sounding like he was reading from a script. When he cut promos, fans believed every word because his passion felt genuine. He represented the American dream in a way that few wrestlers before or since have managed to capture. Wrestling fans saw him as their champion against foreign threats like the Soviet invasion led by the Koloffs. Their 1986 confrontation escalated into a best-of-7 series that captivated wrestling fans across the nation. This wasn't a quick feud that would be resolved in a single match or even a few encounters. Jim Crockett Promotions understood they had something special with these two opponents and decided to stretch their rivalry across multiple months. The best-of-7 format gave fans a reason to follow every single match because each victory or defeat would impact the overall series. Wrestling fans had never seen this kind of long-term storytelling on such a grand scale. The Great American Bash 1986 tour became the backdrop for their epic championship battle across multiple cities throughout the summer. This wasn't just one event, but an entire tour that stretched across the southeastern United States. Wrestling fans in different cities got to see different chapters of this ongoing war. The tour format allowed the feud to build momentum over weeks and months, rather than being resolved in a single night. Each city's audience felt like they were witnessing a crucial piece of wrestling history. Each match in the series grew more violent as both men pushed their bodies to the absolute limit. The first encounters were relatively straightforward wrestling matches, but as the series progressed, the hatred between these characters intensified. Koloff would use his chain as a weapon whenever he could get away with it. Magnum would respond with equally aggressive tactics to level the playing field. Blood became a common sight during their matches as neither man was willing to back down from the physical punishment. After 6 matches, the series was tied with 1 no contest. Everything came down to the decisive 7th encounter. On August 17, 1986, in Charlotte, North Carolina, Koloff delivered a chain-wrapped clothesline to finally defeat his American nemesis and capture the United States Championship. This victory represented the culmination of months of building tension and violence. The chain-wrapped Russian sickle was more devastating than his usual finisher, and it gave him the edge he needed to overcome Magnum's fighting spirit. The crowd was stunned into silence. The broadcast team's reaction captured how unexpectedly brutal the finish felt. On September 28, 1986, Koloff unified the U.S. Championship with Wahoo McDaniel's NWA National Heavyweight Championship. This consolidation of titles gave Koloff even more prestige and established him as the undisputed champion of his division. The unification match against McDaniel, another beloved American wrestler, proved that Koloff's victory over Magnum wasn't a fluke. He was genuinely the dominant force in American wrestling at that time. Dusty Rhodes and the booking committee had already mapped out long-term plans for this feud. The idea was for Magnum to eventually regain momentum and possibly challenge for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, potentially against Koloff himself. This would have been the ultimate payoff for their months-long rivalry and could have elevated both wrestlers to even greater heights. Koloff had reached the absolute peak of his villainous powers with championship gold around his waist. He was the most hated man in professional wrestling and the most successful foreign heel the business had ever seen. His character work was flawless, his championship reigns were convincing, and his feuds drew legitimate heat from wrestling audiences. Everything was perfectly positioned for the next chapter of his wrestling career and his ongoing war with American heroes. But on a seemingly ordinary October evening, everything would change in an instant. Terry Allen was driving home in his silver Porsche 928 on October 14, 1986, when a single moment of lost control sent his car crashing into a utility pole at high speed. The impact was devastating. The car was destroyed and Allen was trapped inside with massive injuries. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital where doctors discovered the full extent of the damage. His spine had been severely injured in the crash, the vertebrae in his neck were fractured and displaced. The accident left Magnum paralyzed from the chest down and ended one of wrestling's most promising careers instantly. Doctors told him he would never walk again. The man who had been climbing toward the top of professional wrestling was now confined to a wheelchair. His wrestling career was over at age 28. All the plans for future championship runs and main event matches were gone in a single night. The accident had taken away everything he had worked for his entire adult life. Wrestling fans mourned the loss of their American hero, while Koloff faced an uncertain future without his perfect rival. The Best of 7 series was over, but not in the way anyone had imagined. There would be no satisfying conclusion to their feud. No revenge match where Magnum could win back his championship. The storyline that had captivated wrestling fans for months was suddenly meaningless in the face of real-world tragedy. Backstage, wrestling promoters had to figure out what to do with Koloff now that his main rival was gone. The Russian villain character had been built specifically to feud with all-American heroes like Magnum TA. Without that dynamic, Koloff's character seemed incomplete. He was the most hated man in wrestling, but he needed the right opponent to make that heat meaningful. Dusty Rhodes saw an opportunity to turn tragedy into compelling television storytelling. The American Dream understood better than most how wrestling could reflect real-world emotions and events. He also recognized the changing political climate with Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power and the emerging policies of glasnost and perestroika. These developments in the Soviet Union created an opening to transform Koloff into a more sympathetic figure. What if they turned wrestling's most hated Russian villain into an American hero through a dramatic character change? The plan was audacious, but Rhodes believed it could work if executed properly. This wasn't just about turning heel to face. This was about completely rewriting everything fans knew about Nikita Koloff. The man who had represented everything evil about the Soviet Union would become someone American fans could cheer for. It was one of the most dramatic character transformations ever attempted in professional wrestling. Rhodes worked with Koloff on the details of how this transformation would happen. It needed to feel organic rather than forced. Wrestling fans were smart enough to recognize a cheap storyline change. The turn had to make emotional sense, even though it seemed impossible on the surface. The catalyst would be Koloff choosing to help American wrestlers rather than continuing his allegiance to the Soviet faction. On October 24, 1986, in Charlotte, North Carolina, Koloff shockingly entered a cage to help Dusty Rhodes against Ole Anderson and J.J. Dillon, a moment that marked his face turn. The crowd couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Russian Nightmare was helping an American wrestler against other villains. He grabbed a microphone and spoke to the stunned audience. For the first time since his debut, Nikita Koloff spoke positively about America and publicly pledged to earn the respect of the American people. The transformation was immediate and complete. He aligned with Dusty Rhodes, completing one of wrestling's most dramatic character transformations in a single night. The crowd that had spent 2 years hating this Russian villain suddenly found themselves cheering for him. The Russian Nightmare had become an American dream, born from real-world tragedy that no one could have predicted. The face turn worked because it was tied to genuine emotion and the changing world around them. But while Koloff was winning over wrestling fans in the Carolinas, powerful forces in the wrestling industry were watching his every move with great interest. Vince McMahon's national expansion campaign was targeting every major star in regional wrestling, and Nikita Koloff was no exception. The WWE owner had declared war on the traditional wrestling business model that had existed for decades. Regional promotions like Jim Crockett Promotions, World-Class Championship Wrestling, and the American Wrestling Association had always respected each other's boundaries. Each company controlled specific geographic areas and rarely tried to steal wrestlers from their competitors. McMahon threw that gentleman's agreement out the window when he decided to take his company nationwide. McMahon's strategy was simple but ruthlessly effective. He would identify the top stars from regional territories and offer them contracts with guaranteed money that local promotions couldn't match. Wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, and Bobby Heenan all jumped from other companies to join McMahon's expanding empire. The WWE owner understood that talent was the key to success in professional wrestling. If he could sign all the best performers, other promotions would be left with nothing but second-rate wrestlers that fans didn't want to see. A persistent story says Vince McMahon offered Nikita a major WWE role, sometimes reported as a WrestleMania 2 program with Hulk Hogan. But Koloff has consistently denied receiving any WWE contract offer. He says he met McMahon only twice. This would have been the ultimate Cold War wrestling storyline, the all-American hero Hogan defending America against the Soviet destroyer Koloff on wrestling's biggest stage. The money potential was enormous for both McMahon and Koloff. The wrestling world remains divided on whether such an offer actually existed. Some wrestling insiders insist that McMahon made a serious play for Koloff during this period. They claim the offer included guaranteed main event money and a prominent role in WWE's national expansion. Other sources suggest the WrestleMania 2 story was exaggerated over the years and that McMahon never made such a specific offer. The truth remains unclear decades later. What is verified and confirmed by multiple sources is Barry Darso's offer for Koloff to join him in forming a new WWE tag team. Darso had already signed with McMahon and was developing the concept for what would eventually become Demolition. The original plan was for Koloff to be Darso's partner in this new team of face-painted destroyers. Demolition would go on to become one of the most successful tag teams in WWE history, holding the tag team championships for a record 478 days. Koloff could have been part of that success, but he declined Darso's recruitment efforts. The financial implications of staying with regional wrestling were significant. WWE was generating millions of dollars more than regional promotions through their national television deals and merchandise sales. Wrestlers who made the jump to McMahon's company often saw their incomes multiply dramatically. Staying with Crockett and NWA likely cost Koloff considerably compared to WWE's national exposure and merchandising, but Koloff has said loyalty was his chief reason for staying. Koloff's loyalty to Jim Crockett Jr. led him to reject any WWE opportunities without serious consideration. He felt a personal obligation to the man who had given him his start in professional wrestling. Crockett had taken a chance on an unknown football player from Minneapolis and turned him into one of wrestling's biggest stars. Koloff believed he owed Crockett his loyalty, even if it meant turning down more money elsewhere. This kind of personal loyalty was becoming rare in wrestling during the 1980s expansion wars. McMahon reportedly took this rejection personally and began a campaign against Koloff. The WWE owner was not accustomed to having wrestlers turn down his offers. He had successfully raided talent from every major territory in the country, and Koloff's rejection was a public embarrassment. Koloff and some wrestling historians have reported that McMahon refused to greenlight Koloff merchandise for years. This meant that Koloff missed out on action figures, video game appearances, and other revenue streams that WWE stars enjoyed during the wrestling boom of the late 1980s. Koloff's decision to stay loyal to NWA preserved his integrity and personal relationships, but it came at a financial cost. The wrestling world would always wonder what might have been if the Russian Nightmare had joined McMahon's empire during its most successful period. Instead, Koloff would forge ahead with Jim Crockett Promotions, where an unexpected partnership was about to create something truly special. The partnership with Dusty Rhodes created wrestling's most unlikely but successful tag team combination. Rhodes' charisma plus Koloff's physical intensity created a chemistry audiences responded to immediately. Wrestling fans who had hated Koloff for years suddenly found themselves cheering for him when he stood alongside the American Dream. The Superpowers became fan favorites almost immediately, battling the Four Horsemen in epic encounters across the country throughout 1987 and 1988. The storyline was perfect for wrestling audiences. The Four Horsemen represented everything that was wrong with America. They were rich, arrogant, and looked down on working-class fans. The Superpowers were the opposite. They fought for regular people who worked hard for their money and deserved respect. Rhodes and Koloff complemented each other perfectly in the ring. Rhodes brought years of experience and natural charisma that connected with audiences instantly. Koloff brought raw power and intensity that made their team genuinely intimidating to opponents. When Rhodes cut promos, he could make fans believe in their cause. When Koloff unleashed his devastating Russian sickle finisher, he could end matches in seconds. Together they were nearly unstoppable during their peak period as a tag team. The April 11th, 1987, Jim Crockett Sr. Memorial Cup win with Dusty Rhodes over the Four Horsemen in the finals marked a major milestone for the Superpowers. This tournament victory was one of the biggest accomplishments of their partnership. They had defeated the most dominant stable in wrestling to win a prestigious tournament named after the founder of the promotion. Wrestling fans celebrated their victory as a triumph of good over evil. Koloff also participated in 2 War Games matches during the 1987 Great American Bash Tour while privately dealing with personal crisis. War Games made Koloff part of one of the era's most brutal, memorable spectacles and reinforced his babyface standing after the turn. This historic match format featured teams battling inside a double-ring steel cage structure. Wrestling fans had never seen anything like War Games before. The matches were brutal and groundbreaking, establishing a new standard for cage match violence. Koloff performed at his usual high level despite the emotional stress he was carrying. Behind the scenes, Koloff was facing a personal crisis that would dwarf any wrestling storyline. In the late 1980s, his first wife Mandy was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. This form of cancer attacks the lymphatic system and can be particularly aggressive in young patients. The diagnosis came at the worst possible time for Koloff's wrestling career. He was finally receiving the fan support he had never experienced as a heel. The superpowers were drawing money and getting pushed toward major championships. Everything was going perfectly in his professional life, just as his personal life was falling apart. The pressure of maintaining his wrestling schedule while caring for a sick wife was taking its toll on Koloff. He would perform in front of thousands of fans and then rush home to be with Mandy during her treatments. The contrast between his public success and private struggle was overwhelming. Wrestling fans saw him as a conquering hero, but he felt helpless watching his wife battle a disease that doctors couldn't cure. Koloff took a sabbatical on November 27, 1988, to care for her, stepping away from wrestling at the peak of his career success. Wrestling promoters tried to convince him to reconsider. The superpowers were making serious money and had momentum that could have carried them for years. But Koloff's priorities were clear. His wife needed him more than wrestling fans did. This decision cost him significant money and career momentum, but Koloff never regretted putting his family first. Mandy died on June 14, 1989, at age 26, leaving Koloff devastated and questioning everything about his life. The man who had conquered wrestling's biggest stages was powerless against life's cruelest opponent. The grief was overwhelming and consuming. Wrestling seemed meaningless compared to the loss he had suffered. For months, Koloff couldn't imagine returning to the ring or entertaining crowds when his personal world had collapsed completely. But wrestling has a way of calling its performers back, and eventually Koloff would face a choice about his future in the business. Koloff returned to WCW on February 24, 1991 at Wrestle War, with a backstage attack on Lex Luger that reminded fans why they had loved watching him compete. The assault was vintage Nikita Koloff. He used his massive frame to overpower Luger and sent a clear message that he was back and ready for war. Wrestling fans who had missed his intensity during his time away immediately responded to his return. The backstage assault generated buzz throughout the wrestling world and proved that Koloff still had the ability to create compelling storylines. 3 years had passed since his sabbatical began. The wrestling landscape had changed dramatically during his absence. New stars had emerged and old rivals had moved on to different companies. But there was still a place for the Russian nightmare in professional wrestling if he wanted it. His comeback promised the redemption story that wrestling fans desperately wanted to see. At Super Brawl I on May 19, 1991, an accidental chain hit on Sting during their encounter showed that ring rust was still affecting his timing. The Russian chain match with Sting at the Great American Bash on July 14, 1991, was more successful and showed flashes of his former dominance. The match featured both wrestlers chained together with a heavy Russian chain that could be used as a weapon. This was the type of brutal encounter that had made Koloff famous during his original run. He moved with the same intensity and power that had made him a main event star years earlier. Wrestling observers noted that his ring work looked sharp despite his extended absence from competition. Sting was at the peak of his popularity during this period and represented everything that WCW wanted in a top babyface. The match between these two powerhouses delivered the kind of hard-hitting action that wrestling fans expected from both competitors. Koloff proved he could still hang with the best wrestlers in the business. His Russian sickle finisher looked as devastating as ever. The crowd responded positively to his performance and seemed ready to embrace his return to regular competition. Brief departures to focus on his fitness business interrupted what could have been a sustained comeback during 1991 and early 1992. Koloff had developed other interests during his time away from wrestling. His fitness business was generating steady income and didn't require the physical punishment that professional wrestling demanded. The stop-and-start nature of his return prevented him from building the momentum that a successful comeback would have required. His February 1992 return featured another War Games appearance at Wrestle War 1992 on May 17th in a star-studded lineup that included some of the biggest names in professional wrestling. The match showcased WCW's top talent in the company's signature match stipulation. Koloff looked comfortable working with the newer generation of wrestlers who had emerged during his absence. His experience in the original War Games matches gave him credibility in this dangerous match environment. The performance proved that he could still compete at the highest level when he was motivated to do so. At Halloween Havoc on October 25, 1992, Koloff faced the monster known as Big Van Vader in what seemed like a routine match between two powerhouse wrestlers. Vader was known for a stiff style, which made the match particularly risky. The former NFL player combined genuine athleticism with an aggressive wrestling style that sometimes crossed the line into actual violence. Wrestling insiders knew that working with Vader required extra caution because of his tendency to work stiffer than most performers. The match was proceeding normally until Vader delivered what should have been a routine clothesline. Wrestling fans had seen thousands of clotheslines over the years. The move was considered one of the safer maneuvers in professional wrestling when executed properly. But something went wrong during this particular exchange. A stiff clothesline led to a herniated disc in Koloff's neck. Koloff knew something was seriously wrong the moment he hit the ground. The pain was unlike anything he had experienced during his wrestling career. He worked a few more house shows, but his last recorded match was a loss to Vader on November 8, 1992. The injury led him to retire from in-ring competition at age 33. The Russian Nightmare's wrestling career was finished, but his story was far from over. Koloff's transformation continued beyond wrestling when he became a born-again Christian in 1993 and eventually became a minister. He runs a ministry and operates the Universal Wrestling Alliance as Outreach. His post-career wrestling appearances included a masked TNA appearance in 2003 as Mr. Wrestling 4, eventually unmasking to help his old partner Dusty Rhodes. His Hall of Fame inductions in the George Tragos Lou Thez Hall of Fame in 2006 and the NWA Hall of Fame in 2008, along with 3 published books, cemented a legacy built on 4 key achievements. He was arguably the most convincing Cold War heel despite being American. His heel-to-face turn remains one of the most successful of the era. His loyalty to Crockett and NWA likely cost him WWE exposure but earned peer respect. His premature retirement at 33 made him a classic what-if of the 1980s boom. Comment your favorite Koloff match or moment below and subscribe for more long-form wrestling historical profiles.